dear to many, and why are they very offensive to many? That also could be argued. I can say that up front. We'll in this talk we won't be talking almost very little about Palestinians directly, but of course it's a direct connection to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which will be coming up, and we'll also be talking about Syria, that the tragedy or the constructed tragedy, if you want to call it, over the last years that led to so much death and destruction, and there's other geopolitical aspects. What I would like to say, first of all, though, is that we see that Turkey-Israeli relations, if we take it as a whole, from 1948 until today, we see that through good times and bad times, they've always retained relations with each other. There's no point in history, I think, where we can say there was a total breakdown. On the other hand, there's no point in history, perhaps of the 1990s, where we can say that there was the 1990s by the military alliances. We can talk about for military people, this was pretty festive days, perhaps. Okay, but we're going to see that overall, they've had relations, and those relations I'm going to talk about in the next 20 minutes. What's interesting is a lot of people don't look at the fact, and I think it's important that I'm saying it here in this building, is that also before the Balfour Declaration in 1917, if you go back to the late Ottoman era, I would argue that this is really when relations begin. And it's always a small footnote in books. In Israeli history, when they write about David Ben-Gurion being in Istanbul or Moshe Sheret being in Istanbul, they studied the two first prime ministers of Israel studied in Istanbul. They studied law because they wanted to become Ottoman parliamentarians for the District of Jerusalem. Okay, so if we look at it in that sense, years later, David Ben-Gurion was going to meet Adnan Menderes. And the fact that it's Adnan Menderes is interesting for the ones that understand Turkish politics, or how he's presented today, that it's him is the first real meetings to go on between him and Ben-Gurion. I always say that David Ben-Gurion probably spoke Turkish with him. He knew Turkish. He knew Ottoman Turkish, which is basically Turkish, and he knew a lot of languages. What language he never bothered to learn was Arabic, which is a pretty interesting side note. But if we look at that sense, we can say that there is some continuity even before Israel. I think what's really would be probably key in understanding this, and maybe in a future research, I'll look at this more, is what was happening in the 1920s and 30s during Mandate Palestine. Were these relations retained? How they were retained? And what kind of connections were there? Later on, we're going to talk about football diplomacy. But I can tell you that already in the early 50s, you can go back in Israeli papers and find, Fenerbahce, I think, goes to Tel Aviv very, very early on. And the Turkish Jews that had come to Palestine and later to the state of Israel were very happy. This is already in the 1950s. The 1990s will come back to the early 2000s, we'll come back to that. And of course, before moving on, we have to also mention the note that we always hear, that Turkey was the first majority Muslim country, not the majority Muslim, the first Muslim country to recognize the Jewish state. And you might be surprised that it was actually under the pressure of America that in 1955 that they had to come silent on the relations, when America was worried that that was going to hurt the Baghdad Pact. That the idea that they didn't want Turkey to look too close, actually, to Israel. So if we start out our conversation this way, we start understanding things differently. Now, in 1950s, we already see the paradigm that's set in place, where Turkey is constantly going to have to balance between, on one hand, not becoming too close to Israel, on the other hand, retaining also ties with the Arab countries. Okay, so this is clear from 1950s onwards that they're going to have to play this balancing act. And the Turkish foreign minister in 1954 commented on this, Fuat Kupurlu, stating that it would be erroneous to propose that ties between Turkey and the Arabs could entail a change in the nature of Turkish policy towards Israel. So this is already in 1954 that he says this. Now, if we wanted to, I think probably the major jump and differences we're going to see in relations happens in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, you could argue that Israel really becomes a domestic issue within Turkey. And how so? It is, on one hand, was seen as the, if you want to call it, the arch enemy of the rise of the leftist ideological movements and the anti-colonial Marxist movements in Turkey that were supporting the PLO and also training together with the PLO, whether it's in Jordan and later on in Lebanon. They had very close relations with different factions in the PLO. And on the other hand, you have the rise of political Islam, which, before I mention that, we'll have to point out that Ephraim Elrom, the Israeli consul general in Istanbul, was kidnapped and executed in 1971 by a leftist radical organization. And then we also get, on the other hand, we get the growing anti-Israeli sentiment that was promoted by Necmettin Erbakan, tainted, I would say, with a great amount of anti-Semitism. So this question of anti-Semitism will come up later on and how this affects Turkish relations with Israel, but it's always there. It's there sometimes on the left, and it's most definitely within the early ideology of Erbakan, but we can also trace this back way before Israel was established as a state. We can go back to the late 1880s, and we have other people in the Ottoman Parliament that I look at that were clearly preaching a type of anti-Semitism. So if we look at this, we also see this Ebu Ziyad Tevfik I'm talking about. We see that there is this continuity also of anti-Semitism within the Turkish realm. And I'm specifically talking about Ottoman Turkish people and not Ottoman Arabs. In my work, I clearly show that actually local Palestinians promoting the cause of anti-Zionist movements already in 1910, 1911 are very clear that they're not supporting anti-Semitism. They make a very clear distinction that between people like Ebu Ziyad Tevfik and what they're arguing against. Now, the major change we want to move forward is, and the new opening, Turkish-Israeli relations were put on hold after the 1980 coup in Turkey. Once again, the government was going to come closer, at this time closer to actually Saudi Arabia, and they put it on hold. And then in 1990s, the major switch is in the Madrid conference, and this is when, of course, when Syria, the Palestinians, and Israel sit down for the first time. And remember, of course, at this point in the Madrid conference, it was local Palestinians from Palestine and not the PLO. And of course, this transfers to the 1993 Oslo Accords, where we're going to see, I guess, the new paradigm, or the obvious is that good relations with Israel are contingent with Israel working towards moving towards some kind of peace agreement with the Palestinians. We're going to see that perhaps that changes in a few minutes when we talk about the AKP, the AKP party. Now, the strengthening of the military alliance is also key in the 1990s. Turkey needs arms to fight the war against the PKK. And America, this is the rise of Amnesty International, different things, pressuring other countries not to give them arms. Israel steps up, and the military alliance between Turkey and Israel is solidified. It develops, all the way up until about 2005 when it starts transferring back to, I would say, civil relations. Now, Turkey also during this time needs Israel to promote their relations in Washington through the different Jewish lobbies, and also to combat their recognition of the Armenian genocide. That Jewish lobbies are also central to this in the 1990s. Now, yes, I would say the problem with Israel military relations is first, we see it come out in the public in Turkey, is with the postmodern coup in 1997. And basically that's over something that it's not connected directly to Israel, but the government, Erbakan, is forced to step down by the military after you have the Jerusalem night, and where basically they're protesting openly Israel, and they're pushing it too far. And at this moment, that's when the postmodern, it's called the Turkish postmodern coup. It's very funny to say that in English, or when I'm teaching it in a class for Turkey, that's what we call the postmodern coup. I always laugh that every Turkish child knows what the word postmodern is, and probably most people, like Turkish kids, don't know what that means actually. We all use the term what that means, postmodern. But we have the 1997 coup that is inherently connected to Israel, and I think Israel at this point, I think they made a mistake also if you're looking at long-term relations and saying, you know, we've got too involved in this. And really their relations became contingent on the Turkish military staying as a sole power in Turkey, which we're going to see changes, of course. Now this is the age in the late 1990s, this is the age of Israeli tourism. A huge percent of Israelis used to visit Turkey, and I would say probably a third or maybe 40 or 50% had actually visited the country. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they know Turkey. They go there for 3 days, they go there 5 days, they go on short trips. But more and more, this is the years I came there, and you would see many Israelis in Istanbul, in different places. And there was a sense that for Israelis, I think it was very important of normalization in the region, I would say. You know, that they said, oh, you know, we're not alone in the region. We also have friends, and this is Turkey. And in a second, I'll show that they were mistaken about this also. And there was a growing presence of Israelis in Ankara. You could see whether they were military people, people related to the arts that were getting grants from the Israeli government to come there. These are the years that Hebrew was started being taught in schools, Israeli professors teaching in universities. Hebrew was extremely popular for a couple of years. And this also, I think, this closeness in relations that we saw really came together, unfortunately, with the 1999 earthquake in Turkey, where Israel sent medical teams. And I would say there was this, for the first time you could see open conversation in Turkey about accepting these friends as friends. And you know, Israel is actually seen in a very positive light. This is back to football diplomacy. This is when Chaim Revivo, I wrote about before, I said they were cheering in 2002, 2003, Chaim Revivo, bringing out Israeli flags to Fenerbahce matches and different matches. And this would change in a couple of years. But I think the important part is the growing public presence of this. April 2002, it's very important to look at. Before the AKP, before Erdogan comes to power, you have the Jenin massacre in April 2002. And this is the moment that is very clear that there's across-the-board opposition to normalization of relations with Israel if it comes on account of Palestinians. Okay, and I remember that time I was in Besiktas Square, and you see every political party there writing Israel's committing genocide, and they're really coming against the military and saying we need to rethink our relations with Israel. Now, the AKP, we'll go to the AKP years, to Erdogan's years, and if we look beyond the rhetoric, we'll see that Turkey has not strayed from its general policy towards Israel that I talked about before. It's recognized Israel's right to exist and support a two-state solution. This has pretty much been, since 1967, Turkish policy. That really hasn't changed. The general trends during the last 15 years, I think 2002 is 15 years now, Erdogan's in power, or his party's in power, and we see a slow but steady end to the military alliance. At the same time, we see a steady increase between Israel and Turkey as economic partners, which provided stability despite the heated rhetoric between the two states. So we see that despite heated rhetoric, the economic relations between the two countries have only got stronger over the last 5-10 years. And I would argue, this is perhaps it might be surprising, but I say that this period can be summed as recognition by Turkey that the relations will continue, basically, quote, no matter what happens. And that I can maybe explain a little more later. And now I would say the trend is that this is matched by Israel's recognizing that relations with Turkey is not worth it at all costs. So if there's a headline to this conversation today, it's that Turkish-Israeli relations have transformed from what it was for most of the AKP years, where Israel was the main factor in trying to keep relations on track, and now it's switched during the last few years with Turkey trying to keep the relations on track. Okay, and I think that's a major change we're going to see, that today Turkey is more interested in relations with Israel than Israel is with Turkey. And we might bring that up for questions. Now, I'm not going to go through, I imagine I have about 5 more minutes.
You're doing great on time.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm not going to go into every detail of the AKP years, but let's talk about a general overview of the years. The height of relations was when Turkey served as an intermediary between Syria and Israel with Ehud Olmert in 2008. This is really, we see, there's this idea, or this, for years it was being always discussed in Israel, can Turkey serve as an intermediator between Israel and the Arab countries? And we saw that work with Syria. The agreement never came about, and the hopes were all dashed just months later with Operation Cast Lead. And from that moment, we're going to see is that Turkey is no longer seen, from 2008 until today, is no longer seen as a possible mediator between Israel and the Palestinians or any other Arab country. And then we have a steady deterioration in relations. This was from the Davos affair, when Erdogan said to Shimon Peres, you know how to kill, you guys know how to kill, it was something to this extent. We had the Gaza flotilla, and then Mavi Marmara in 2011. That really, I thought was, it's quite telling in the sense that relations survive this. And both sides, even if they individually pull their ambassadors, Israel works basically as business as usual. If we can keep this at a sort of a low-level relations with Turkey, but make sure that they survive, we'll let Turkey bash us in the public sphere, we'll let Turkey yell, the rhetoric, it doesn't matter, because one thing is important. We can see that during these years, the economy, the two countries are coming closer. We have the April 2013 apology by Netanyahu for the Gaza affair, and we see that this was accepted, but Turkey added a new demand, and that demand was the lifting of the Gaza blockade. Israel held the ground and said, absolutely not. We're not going to touch the Gaza blockade. And we're going to see in a second that Turkey accepts the continuation of the blockade eventually. Summer 2014, I think relations really hit a really dangerous moment, and it was in Israel's war in Gaza, and that leads to almost a complete breakdown. And during this period, I think this really, for the first time, we see an extremely dangerous type of anti-Semitism arise in Turkey. This in itself is self-defeating. Many of the local Turkish Jews feel this, and actually already the immigration to Israel and other places, Jews begin to leave. And then later on we can talk about that important key of them also serving as mediators between Israel and Turkey, right? But I think after this summer, Israel made clear that they didn't want the government, at least, to be openly anti-Semitic. This is when I wrote an article called State-Sanctioned Anti-Semitism, and where I actually was able to pinpoint very anti-Semitic rhetoric among government ministers. And I didn't even connect this to words of Erdogan, which many people go straight to him. I looked at different ministers in the government. Now, the shift in relations surprised everyone December 2015, just when Erdogan's returning from a trip to Saudi Arabia. He says openly, Israel needs Turkey, but we have to admit that we also need Israel. And this was at the moment that there was rumors of, Turkey possibly cutting a deal with Israel for natural gas that we can talk about later. In March 2016, a group of Israelis were killed in a terrorist attack in Istanbul. This is a whole line of terrorist attacks that had taken place in Istanbul and Ankara. I thought it was interesting then that AKP capped immediately anti-Semitic language in the public sphere. It's clear that they're trying to, at times, clean that up. A very low-level AKP member of the women's branch tweeted something about the almost very happy about these were Israeli Jewish people killed, and not Israeli Arabs, not Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. And she was removed quickly from her position. It took about 2 hours, I think. It happened really quick. I think that was also a message to Israel. Now, June 26, we see reconciliation between the two countries. Turkey renounces its demand to lift the blockade. Israel says, you know what? Basically, if you want to give aid to Gaza, it's going to go through our, security. It's going to go through Tel Aviv, it's going to go through Ashkelon, whatever. And they cut some kind of deal that Turkey could come down and not look completely humiliated that they actually accepted this. But de facto, the blockade continued. Turkey was then speaking about investment in Gaza, power stations, different things of different infrastructure, and nothing of this has come about. And I commented in an article in 2016 when this happened that Erdogan treats Israel as an equal partner for the first time. So I think that was the change. At the same time, when it happened, this is a month before the coup in Turkey, the coup attempt in Turkey. And when I was asked, I said, Israel realizes that it's not the same Turkey also. And I think that continues until today. Israel sees Turkey as an unstable player in the region, and they're not going to invest too much in the relations. They're very happy to have them, and that's really the change here. That's when I said that actually Turkey needs Israel, and Israel put Turkey on hold for a couple of years, and in this sense, people personally know how I write. I'm no fan of Netanyahu, but Netanyahu really got it his way, I would say, concerning the reconciliation. Now, where does this leave us? And how can we explain the change in dynamics? We could start at Turkey's misreading the Arab Spring in 2011, siding with the wrong parties, adopting the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as a project. I would say that turned out to be a failure for him personally. Also, you remember Mohammed Morsi when he was put on stage in 2012 in the AKP convention, the fourth convention, or fourth or fifth main party convention. You could clearly see that he put all his eggs in that basket. Also, support for Hamas also has never paid off. Probably a big change is that Israel was, over the last couple of years, has turned into, I would say, an economic powerhouse. If we look at neoliberalism, neo-capitalism, we can see that Israel has really, that's a major shift. Today, they have about $5 billion in trade between Israel and Turkey. Turkey is number 9 in terms of imports to Israel. Anyone that goes to Israel will see Turkish products everywhere. You know, my daughter is there. She sends me pictures all the time. Oh, Dad, look at this. You know, juice. And then there's. I'm not talking about the major infrastructure, whether we're talking about vegetables or sprinkler systems or other things, typical things that they've been doing. They're also importing a lot of food products also from Turkey today. So it's that's something. Turkish Airlines, if you looked at, Turkish Airlines actually has made my life because it's so easy. When I talk about Istanbul, New York, Tel Aviv, that's the only way I could have done it. If there weren't direct flights, we're 6 to 12 flights a day at Turkish Airlines to Israel. Last year, for the first time, 1 million passengers flew to and from Tel Aviv via Istanbul. So for Israelis now, Istanbul is a major hub for them. To get to anywhere in the world, United States, Thailand, Senegal, South Africa, it doesn't, Turkish Airlines flies more places than any other airlines. And they're much more competitive, very competitive in the price. So many Israelis fly them, and many tourists that are going to Israel flies Turkish Air. During these, since 2011, Israel turned into a gateway for Turkish exports to Jordan and Saudi Arabia. So instead of course, you have the breakout of the Syrian war, you have instability in Iraq with the different places. So a lot of the imports come to the Haifa port. From the Haifa port, they cross over to Jordan, and from Jordan they go to Saudi Arabia. They go to the different Gulf places. So, and this was done with almost no publicity, no news. I mean, everyone they know it was going to happen. These were often Turkish trucks that were actually bringing the goods, and they were escorted